Welcome back to another edition of The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a story that completely flips the traditional tech narrative on its head. We're going to explore the silicon startup era, specifically looking at the years between 1969 and the 1980s to zoom in on advanced microdevices, or as you probably know them, AMD. Their counterintuitive origin story as a strategic underdog is honestly going to reshape how you think about building a tech empire. So do you have to invent to win in Silicon Valley? It's a pretty provocative question, right? Because the modern assumption is just a resounding yes. We're constantly told startups absolutely must disrupt from day one with these groundbreaking products. But during its early years, AMD took a completely alternative path, a really brilliant path that proves you actually don't always have to be the primary inventor on day one to eventually win the whole game.
All right, let's get into it. Section 1, the second source strategy, or winning from the back seat.
To understand how AMD survived and thrived back then, we really have to transport ourselves to the reality of the semiconductor market in 1969. The second source model they adopted was a highly calculated, deliberate strategy. Instead of trying to out-invent the giants right out of the gate, AMD just decided to manufacture high-quality, perfectly compatible logic chips. Stuff like standard shift registers and computer line drivers that were originally designed by other leading companies. Think of them like the highly reliable understudy in a massive Broadway production. You know, they weren't writing the script, and they definitely weren't the marquee name on the poster initially, but they knew every single line, and they were ready to step onto the stage and perform flawlessly the absolute second the market demanded it.
Now, you might be wondering, why would a market even need an understudy? Well, back then, the largest customers were massive government entities and giant enterprise buyers who were building critical infrastructure. When you're building military technology or vital systems, you literally cannot rely on just one single supplier for your critical components. Imagine if that one supplier has a factory fire or a strike, your entire multi-million-dollar project just halts. So these massive buyers absolutely required multiple suppliers to ensure total reliability and guarantee that continuity of supply. AMD saw this massive, unfulfilled need in the market and just perfectly capitalized on it.
Moving on to Section 2, military-grade reliability focus, perfecting, not just copying.
Under the pivotal leadership of Jerry Sanders, AMD made a really crucial distinction. They were perfecting, not just copying. Your standard Me Too manufacturer back then cared only about basic compatibility. Just make a chip that fits the slot and mostly works. But AMD's philosophy was entirely different. They emphasized strict quality control, implementing these rigorous military-grade testing standards. Sanders was absolutely determined that AMD would deliver superior reliability and performance within its role as a second source. So they weren't competing on originality yet, but they were fiercely competing on execution and quality. And what does that obsession with military-grade quality actually get you? Trust. By refusing to compromise on testing and reliability, this strategy positioned AMD as a fundamentally trusted and dependable supplier in a rapidly growing semiconductor market. They essentially proved to the biggest buyers in the world that an AMD chip wasn't just some generic backup, it was a rock-solid guarantee. And this immense trust they built, that was the exact foundation they needed for their next monumental leap forward.
Which brings us to Section 3, the 1976 Intel deal, a major turning point.
So all the tension of AMD's early limitations as just a secondary manufacturer finally gets released as this strategy pays off across the decade. They launched in 1969 using that strict second source model, and they spent 7 years just grinding, proving their manufacturing excellence. Then, boom, 1976 arrives. AMD and Intel sign a historic cross-licensing agreement. And by the late 1970s, because of this deal, AMD levels up their manufacturing portfolio dramatically and begins producing Intel's own x86 chips. To be specific, the 1976 agreement allowed AMD to manufacture and sell Intel's incredibly important x86 processors. We're talking about the legendary 8086 and 8088 chips here. They had officially graduated from making standard logic and memory chips to manufacturing the absolute cutting edge of computing brains. They were handed the keys to the kingdom simply because they had spent years proving they were the most reliable manufacturer in the game. Let's look at Section 4, powering the IBM PC, the ultimate validation.
Now you have to ask, why would Intel, a major innovator, share their prized designs with a competitor in the first place? Well, it came down to a chain reaction of industry forces. IBM was building their personal computer, and true to form for a massive enterprise, they strictly required multiple sources for all their PC components. They flat out refused to rely on just one company. Meanwhile, Intel desperately wanted their chips inside the IBM PC, but they needed a stable, scalable supply chain to satisfy IBM's strict multiple-source demands. Enter AMD. Because of that military-grade reliability focus we talked about earlier, Intel tapped AMD to help secure the massive contract. AMD's highly specific strategy made them the absolute perfect puzzle piece.
As a direct result of these industry dynamics, AMD becomes the official second-source manufacturer for IBM's PCs. I want you to really let the weight of that sink in for a second. This wasn't just some lucrative contract. It was the ultimate validation of AMD's entire business model from day one. It gave the company a vital, incredibly lucrative foothold in the rapidly expanding personal computer industry. They were officially inside the most important machine of the decade.
This entire era set the stage for AMD's future evolution from a secondary supplier into a major innovator in its own right. AMD proved that mastering the supply chain, actually choosing to be the absolute best backup manufacturer in the world, wasn't a limitation, it was the ultimate Trojan horse. By earning trust through flawless execution, they bought themselves a front-row seat to the future, positioning themselves perfectly for long-term technological dominance.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this thought. How can mastering the fundamentals as a reliable backup pave the way for true innovation? AMD's story from 1969 through the 1980s teaches us that, you don't always have to reinvent the wheel on your very first day. Sometimes being the absolute most reliable person in the room is exactly what gives you the leverage, the capital, and the trust to eventually change the world. Makes you wonder, who are the strategic underdogs today that might just be tomorrow's leaders? Keep that in mind as you look at the tech landscape. Thanks so much for learning with me today, and I'll catch you on the next explainer.